All right. Wow. Welcome. And the panelists, could you please unmute yourselves?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to briefly just have you introduce yourselves one at a time, and then we can get started. Hi, Abby. Thanks so much for joining us for Moms Demand Action. And I'm going to have you introduce yourself first.
Thank you, Sally, for having us and for inviting moms. My name is Abbey Winter. I'm one of the state chapter leads for Moms Demand Action here in Colorado.
Tom, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Tom Mauser, and I am a member of the board of Colorado Ceasefire, its spokesman, and I'm the father of Daniel Mauser, who was one of the victims at Columbine High School.
Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I appreciate it. Hi, Gordon.
Hi, I'm Gordon McLaughlin. I had been a longtime deputy district attorney in Larimer County, and I'm now a candidate for district attorney here in the 8th Judicial District.
Thanks so much. Hi, Ike.
Hello, I'm Ike McCorkle. Thanks for having me this evening. I'm a retired Marine officer. I'm also a gun owner. My son was also present at the Stem Highlands Ranch shooting. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and discussing these important issues with all of you guys this evening. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. And I'm glad that we have a perspective of a gun owner to be part of the panel. So thank you. Hi, Cathy.
Hi, Sally. How are you?
I'm great.
And I apologize for the bad light. I'm used to my outdoor office, but I'm not outside because of the temperatures tonight. But thank you for having me. I'm State Representative Cathy Kipp, and I represent most of the eastern half of Fort Collins.
Thanks so much for being here. We're going to talk about some of the legislation that didn't make it into the session that we'd like to talk about. So I'd love to have your input on that. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Sally. My name is Brian Mason. I'm a candidate for District Attorney in Colorado's 17th Judicial District, which is all of Adams County and Broomfield counties. Thank you so much for including me tonight.
Absolutely. Hi, Kenzie. Thanks so much for being here.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so honored to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Kenzie, or you may know me by Enzie. I am a local Colorado musician, and I went to high school in Loveland, Colorado at Mountain View, and I'm just a very passionate voter.
And you're going to give the perspective of growing up with gun violence, right? With schools. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I read your paper. I was really moved by that. So thank you. Okay. Well, I just want to appreciate all the panelists for being here and to bring different perspectives to this really important topic. And you can put your questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best to facilitate. We have a lot of people on the call, and I would love to get to questions. So please feel free to start putting those in the chat for the panelists. And I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Sally Boccella, and I'm running for Senate District 23, which encompasses parts of Weld and Larimer counties and Broomfield County. So I'm really excited to have some of the panelists that are in my district represented here. So, and their perspective to this conversation. So thanks so much. Abby, I'm going to throw it to you to start us off. We discussed basically some of the things that I wanted to bring up in this hour. It's going to go really quick. So please guide us. Thanks.
Well, again, thanks for having us and having this conversation, because even without COVID, I think it's such a pressing issue. It's a public health crisis. We need to look at gun violence with that comprehensive lens. But COVID and the ensuing lockdowns has certainly exacerbated some of the issues that we've seen with gun violence. So two of the bills, and I know we want to get to the domestic violence one also, two of the bills, particularly the lost and stolen that was introduced back in March, and the responsible storage. We've seen instances of those types of gun violence increase with COVID. I know right there in Westminster a few months ago, a 3-year-old was shot and killed by her brother who had accessed a firearm, an unsecured firearm. So we know those firearm deaths are preventable with safe storage. You had talked a little bit about gun owners who want to say, well, I need my firearm to protect my home. I use it for home defense. There's plenty of technology and plenty of tools readily available so that you can balance that safety so that your 3-year-old, your 7-year-old, your 17-year-old can't access your firearm. So we've got biometric safe. We have trigger locks that can unlock in, fractions of a second. And what you've done is, you've kept yourself safe, but more importantly, you've kept your family from accessing that. And then the lost and stolen. I know here in Denver, DPD reported earlier this summer that firearms stolen from vehicles had increased 27% over the previous 3-year average. So again, locking up your firearms, they're so interconnected. Locking up your firearms can and will save lives. And it's no surprise that we've seen an increase in youth gun violence here in Denver over the summer.
Thanks so much. Representative Kipp, can you please address some of this? So Abbey brought up some really great pieces of legislation that we did not get to really introduce this last session because of COVID. I wanted to basically talk a little bit about each bill and the importance of each bill. And then also try to address some of the barriers, like what are some of the things that is the pushback on those so that we can basically address them and move through them.
Well, honestly, the gun bills were not introduced that long before the pre-COVID session let out, right? So we let out on March 14th, and then we were gone for nearly 2 months. And, gun bills at the Capitol are always controversial, no matter what they are, because frankly, some people lost their seats over those bills back in 2013, right? Some other gun bills. So people are afraid because Democrats actually lost their majority in the Senate because of the gun bills. And so there is a fear that could happen again. And nobody wants to lose the majorities because frankly, all of our lives are easier when we are in the party that has a majority and it allows us to better accomplish our agenda. But we have a lot of Democrats, at least in my chamber, and I'm pretty sure in the Senate chamber too. Amazingly enough, Senate and House, even though we're only a few hundred feet away, we don't actually talk to each other that often. So, I'd heard a lot about the bills, but frankly, they really hadn't gotten through the system and into my chamber. And then after the COVID break, it was just considered, we're going to be coming back for a 3-week session, and we want to do bills that are, for the most part, they are not all of them were, fairly, the theme was fast, friendly, and free. And gun legislation, even if we think it's low-hanging fruit, is never considered fast, friendly, or free. I mean, it costs you political capital, and is this the time to do this? Is this what we want to focus on when everything else is going on? I will just tell you a little bit about when we passed the red flag bill last year. In my chamber, it was a partisan vote. It came down to, even though, we're just taking guns out of the hands of people that are having a mental health crisis for a limited period of time, it was still considered to be a really big deal. Even though 80% of the voters tend to approve this type of legislation, it was considered, I voted for it, all my Democratic folks voted for it, but we did have people who were on the other side of the aisle who, they were very united in what they call their Second Amendment rights, right? And a lot of us feel like, your Second Amendment right ends when my life is at stake. So it is a very challenging thing. I don't want to really go into the details because I think Abbey covered those, and I'm not, as I said, an expert on those because they really didn't come into the chamber. But we were expecting, even with bills that are just common sense bills, to have a very challenging session because of those.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You know, you mentioned about the Second Amendment. And honestly, when I think about common sense gun legislation, it has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. It doesn't weaken the Second Amendment. If anything, I think it makes it stronger. And I think that's one of the things that we have so many amazing advocates on here too from Moms Demand Action that can speak to that as well, who I've been having some really great conversations with during this campaign and learning from them. But I wanted to talk a little bit too, like Gordon and Brian, bring that perspective of the district attorney office into some of this conversation in regards to some of the legislation that we're looking to pass. Like Gordon, we've talked about 1278, the domestic violence bill. Talk a little bit about that and why it's important.
Yeah, so what a lot of folks don't realize is right now in Colorado, it's already prohibited for domestic violence offenders to possess firearms. So while that may be controversial and some people may not like that, that's already the law. The question with that bill is, what are we doing to actually enforce that? And frankly, the answer in a lot of places is nothing. It's not being followed up on. So judges are giving folks orders in court when they come in on a domestic violence crime, saying if you have any firearms in your home, you have to surrender those. And then it sort of ends there, and there's no follow-up. So the question is, what can we do to actually make sure that already lawful order is actually being followed up on and enforced? Because as folks mentioned earlier, maybe or we'll get into, getting firearms out of the hands of domestic violence offenders is one of the top things we can do to keep our community safe, and is one of the biggest risk factors for putting domestic violence victims at further harm, not even just harm from a firearm, but harm generally. So that's really important, and some places have been proactive on that. Denver County, for instance, has an investigator with the district attorney's office that follows up on those crimes or those possible incidents of possession. And so I think that's something we need to look into doing, and that's what that bill addresses, making sure that happens.
You know, I was talking to somebody, and one of the barrier, like one of the pushbacks on that is the Fifth Amendment. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a fair concern. The folks' Fifth Amendment rights are sacred to our democracy and how our criminal justice system works. That being said, essentially what the bill ended up saying is that if you admit to having a firearm for whatever reason, that can't be used against you. So if that was to be some other sort of crime, you would not be able to be prosecuted for that, because the goal, right, isn't necessarily to prosecute someone for their crimes. The goal is to get the firearm out of the hand of someone that it's dangerous in, and someone who might be putting someone in harm's way. And so in my estimation, that addressed that problem. I understand perhaps some in the defense bar didn't end up agreeing with that. But I think that's an appropriate way to address that, and that cured the issue in my mind.
Oh, thank you, Gordon. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Gordon covered it really well. People often ask me as a candidate for district attorney, what can DAs do about gun violence? And there's a handful of things, and relinquishment is at the top of the list. So making sure that we are enforcing the law that's already there with respect to domestic violence convictions and getting those guns out of those hands. Every single prosecutor I know, including me, when I was a baby DA, had a case in county court where it's a third-degree assault, which is pretty low on the totem pole in terms of seriousness. It's not a felony, but a third-degree assault domestic violence case where we look at the case and we say, I'm worried this woman is going to be on the coroner's autopsy table someday. Because entry-level domestic violence cases, which don't yet rise to felony behavior, is often a predictor of much more serious crimes, sometimes lethality and lethal crimes later on. So making sure that we have a mechanism for getting those guns is really important. And I guess I'll add one thing to what Gordon said. some judges don't issue the orders at all. And we as DAs and DA offices have to make sure that we are asking the judges to actually issue an order about relinquishment of the gun. And then, of course, the process of getting that gun is also really, really important.
We have a question, actually, and I think Brian and Gordon, you'd be best to answer this. Is there a law that allows domestic violence offenders to have their property searched for guns?
Well, I guess I'd say if there's probable cause to think that there's a weapon in violation of some law, then yes.
Yeah, and of course, typically for law enforcement to search any kind of a property, you need to have, as Gordon said, probable cause and typically a warrant. And we believe in the rule of law, and so meeting those legal thresholds is critical. But again, you have hurdles, and part of those hurdles are logistical. After somebody pleads guilty to a third-degree assault, and again, I'm referring to lower-level domestic violence cases, those folks typically are going on probation. They're not going to jail. They're not going to prison. And so what is the mechanism for then following them home or setting up an appointment to go to their house and get their guns? And law enforcement, understandably, don't want to walk into situations that could become lethal for them. So it's a challenge. It's a public safety challenge and a public policy challenge.
Well, that's a good segue into the ERPO law, right? The red flag law. I think that law not only protects domestic violence and potential victims, but it also prevents loss of life for suicide ideation, but it also protects law enforcement, right? Because they don't know what they're walking into. So let's talk a little bit about that. And, from a perspective of a gun owner, I also wanted to address, just so you could bring that perspective to us, because I don't own a gun, but I know many people that do, and they also agree that it is the responsibility of that gun owner to have common sense gun legislation, right? Because it is a liability if you're not responsible. So talk a little bit about the red flag law and how, do you think that infringes on your constitutional rights as a gun owner?
I don't think that it infringes on the Second Amendment of 2A rights at all. I think that the extreme risk protection order is something that has needed to be in place for a long time. And there's real good reasoning behind, its need. And, my good friend, excuse me, sorry about my voice. I have a paralyzed vocal cord. So if I kind of screech out, you guys are welcome to laugh at me. It's no problem. but the thing is with the extreme risk protection order is that, those are very, rare instances where an individual is a danger to themselves or to others. And like my good friend, former Marine Lieutenant Pete Allen, he had those suicidal ideations. They were demonstrated, they had been present, and I believe that, had an extreme risk protection order been in place and had his, spouse been able to ask a judge to have those firearms secured during that time of mental instability in his life, I believe that he would be here today. And that's what the extreme risk protection order, the red flag law, is all about. It's about taking care of each other, about protecting each other during a time of mental hardship. And that's what we would all want to happen, I believe, even for ourselves. If we were experiencing a period of mental instability, I would think that we would want our friends and our family, our loved ones that are concerned about our well-being, to look out for our well-being, to be responsible citizens. And so I think that the red flag law is something that needed to be passed. And just like, our lifelong Republican Sheriff Tony Spurlock supported it and faced a lot of opposition in doing so. But that's the kind of leadership that we need demonstrated right now in these tough times, is folks that are willing to tell the truth and speak truth to power, and be able to convey messages even if they don't resound well with the folks that typically support them. That's what leadership is all about, and taking care of each other. And that's what the red flag law is all about. And so, I think it's a critical piece of legislation. I also think it's a piece of legislation, myself running for federal office, that we need on the national level. We need a federal red flag law or a federal extreme risk protection order, so that all law enforcement agencies across the nation have the ability to protect their citizens adequately.
Thank you, Ike. I appreciate that. Thank you. So some people have some questions, and I think we can address that with the district attorney candidates. Does the ERPO have the same logistical enforcement problems that exist with domestic violence offenders? That essentially is just a court order?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Gordon, if I may. It does, but it's easier because it's an actual process where law enforcement comes into a courtroom, asks for an ERPO order, and once they have the order, they have the permission to go get the gun. That's different with a domestic violence situation because there isn't after somebody pleads guilty or is convicted of domestic violence, law enforcement doesn't have a warrant in their hands to go to their home and search it. With ERPO, you do. And so ERPO is actually an easier mechanism to enforce than relinquishment on DV cases is.
So in regards to the red flag law, what are some of the cases that would make a judge not follow that, like to do a court order? Let's just say that a police officer comes in and says, I would like to do this, and what would make them not? Because the way I read it was you don't have to have actual evidence, right?
Well, you certainly have to have evidence.
What kind of evidence?
Well, to some extent, it hasn't been litigated that much that I don't think we know what every judge is going to do. Most jurisdictions have put certain judges in charge of this so that the same judges are seeing this. Just anecdotally, I can say here in Larimer County, we had one of the first petitions, and it was denied, because the relationship, you can only file it if you have certain relationships, essentially if you're a blood relative of someone or if you're in law enforcement. And the person who filed it was not a relative and did not have other standing to do so. And so the judge denied it. Folks that are opposed to the red flag laws sort of took that to mean, well, folks are misusing this law. Those in favor of it, myself included, I think took it to mean the process is working appropriately. That the judge denied the motion. She didn't have standing, that the law didn't apply to her position.
I do remember that case.
Yeah, so I think it has worked. And as Brian said, that there's a good process for it. That doesn't mean it's easy, but there is a process in place to do that.
Gordon, I'm sorry to interrupt.
One second. I'm sorry, Leslie. I just want to correct myself. When I say that no evidence, what I meant is say, it's on record that this person that the police have been called out for a domestic disturbance or something to that effect. And so it's on record. And so after so many times, somebody who is in that household or, potentially does not feel safe, they can go ahead and request that through the courts, right?
You could. I mean, you need some sort of evidence of that it's an imminent threat.
Okay.
Not just that the person may be a danger and you're scared, though those are obviously concerning facts, but that there's some actual imminent risk of harm, and that person may be using, likely to use that weapon. So it's a high burden, and I think it was specifically written to be a high burden, and maybe some of the legislators, Cathy or someone, could speak to sort of the thought process, but it was a high burden because the Second Amendment is a right in the Constitution, and you need a high burden to overcome that.
Okay. Leslie, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, thank you for clarifying that. The only question that I had was, what was the relationship to that person? Like, was it if it's not a blood relative or law enforcement, how, like, I guess I'm just curious in that instance.
Yeah, it was a strange instance. It's actually a very sad story where the person who filed it had a child that was killed in an encounter with law enforcement in Larimer County. So she filed it against a police officer at CSUPD asking to take his weapon away. So certainly I think everyone feels horribly for this mother, but the fact is that the law just didn't apply to her situation.
Okay.
We have another question. I understand having guns, hunting, going to shooting ranges, sport, etc. But how do we control the balance between the Second Amendment and safety? I think all the latest protests where people have been getting shot, will we be able to have places that are legally considered gun off limits? That's a good question. Who wants to take that?
I can speak to it. Oh,
okay.
Go ahead,
Cathy. Go ahead, Cathy.
Well, I was just going to say that, on our school grounds in Colorado, you cannot carry a gun, right? You can't, and not unless you're one of the SROs that are there for security reasons. And unfortunately, a number of years ago, I don't know exactly what year, but they repealed the law that says you can't have them on college campuses. And personally, I think that's a dangerous place to go. A lot of that really is up to what we set up in state law. And of course, you do get pushback every time with people claiming that, their Second Amendment rights are being violated. But, many people have different interpretations of the Second Amendment.
Cathy, I just found that out, that campuses allow them. I had no idea. So yes, that was disturbing to me, being a former student on campus every day, thinking I was fine, and knowing that some of my classmates could have had a concealed weapon in class. So I don't understand that. How is a college campus any different than any other education institution? So I do think that's something that we should address. I'm not sure if is that at the state level or is that at the region level?
I believe that's at the state level. And, it's really interesting, though, because I sat on the State Affairs Committee at the beginning of the session, and we had some people who were trying to repeal the gun laws that had been passed back in 2013, 2012. And it was very interesting because no matter where you go, that is the conversation that people have, is about their particular rights. And I guess the same people, I think, come and testify on these bills every year. But there was one woman who got up and testified, and she basically said, if I go into my kid's school and I can't have my gun there, because their whole philosophy is that a good guy with a gun will take out a bad guy with a gun, right? Who knows how you tell the good guys are, but they all think that they're the good guys. And she's like, well, I'm just not safe if I'm sitting there going to my kid's student performance. But there are no, active gun procedures at in the buildings when you do that. So you just know that some people, regardless of what the law is, are feeling that they have their Second Amendment right, and that they're going to do what they think is right, which is, in that case, carry the gun into her kid's auditorium and do the play, because somebody else could shoot and she's going to be the great hero and rescue him. It's a very interesting and problematic philosophy.
While we're talking about violence on campuses, Kenzie, why don't you talk a little bit about your experience growing up in this norm environment? What's it been like?
Absolutely. Honestly, not to even sugarcoat it, it's definitely terrifying. So I was born the year of the Columbine shooting. And so I just grew up always knowing that, like, you know, the code D danger drills, like when you would hide under your desk because there was someone on campus that shouldn't be. And I just often found myself constantly looking for escape routes. Like fires didn't scare me, tornadoes, natural disasters. Like I was like, yeah, that's uncontrollable. But to me, I always felt that gun violence, especially on schools, were so that like it was very not easy to control. And because as Cathy said, there's always pushback when legislation like that comes into play. But for me, it was constantly like, if I'm hiding, you know, in the corner of the classroom and someone does get in, I'm just like, it's like monkeys in a barrel. Like wherever you shoot, you'll hit someone, and it's horrifying. I've had several gun threats on my high school campus where we had to lock down, and there were several teachers who even disagreed with the way that the school administration handled lockdown drills, to where like I knew teachers that kept bats like in the room to like if someone were to get in to just start swinging. And I knew other teachers who happened to have an outdoor door that said like, we will leave as soon as we can because we're not going to sit in the classroom, because if you are, that you won't survive. And I think that was the hardest part, is knowing before I was even a legal adult that like I could die at any minute on my high school campus.
That's horrifying. I mean, as a parent, I think about that. You know, I never experienced it until 2 years ago. I was one of those parents that was getting those phone calls and those emails saying about lockdowns and that they were going to evacuate our students. Please come get them because there's a threat. It turned out to be false, thank goodness. But it was, you know, very emotional. And what really was concerning to me was how the students basically, it was normal to them.
Yeah.
So that to me is a concern. It should never be normal. Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, you're very passionate about this, and talk a little bit about how it should never be normal, and why passing common sense gun legislation is so important. Oh, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself. Tom. There you go. That's okay.
Yeah, first, I want to go back and comment on a couple of things that have been said. You had asked about the guns on campus and what happened there, and is it state or federal? It is state level. The issue became that in 2002, 2003, when they passed the concealed weapons law in Colorado, changes from a may issue state to a shall issue. The thinking was that the language gave the ability to our colleges to choose to allow or not allow. And for years, it went that way, that they weren't allowed on our college campuses. Somebody then challenged that legally, and the ruling was that the colleges didn't have that right. And so now you can have guns on campus. I want to add something too about the issue of red flag, because I think a big part of keeping these laws in place is defending them and educating people.
Yes.
The case of red flag, you know, so often we pass gun laws, we have the gun lobbies saying, why are you passing these laws? They only work against the good law-abiding citizen. We should be aiming the laws at the bad guys, you know, the people who are a problem. Well, red flag law did that. It was aimed specifically just at people who are a danger, and yet we have the gun lobby fighting it all the way. So you have to be prepared to answer some of the arguments that they have. For me, the biggest passion was that in the case of Columbine, we had a loophole in our law that allowed someone to go to a gun show and purchase a firearm without a background check, just by going to the table of a private seller. And that's what the Columbine killers did. They knew that. They purposely went there so they could stay under the radar. And I think that's the biggest thing. Really what we're doing is we're closing loopholes. We're looking at where we have problems with our laws and we're closing them. So often we have the gun lobby saying, don't pass new laws, enforce the old ones. I would agree we need to enforce the existing laws, but when those existing laws have loopholes, we need to close.
Thank you so much. That's actually one of the things that I wanted to address, and I was talking to Abbey about that, is the loopholes with the private versus the licensed gun sellers and the people that are selling on Craigslist. They're not licensed, but they still can do that. So I think that we do need to close the loopholes on these things, because that's where people are probably getting the most, they're purchasing the firearms mostly, right? It's not through the legal, your gun stores that are legally licensed. So how do we do that? Is that on the federal? Is that on the state?
Right now, it's actually at the state level, because the feds, Congress won't do anything about it. It's had to be at the state level that we have said we need to pass universal background check bills, like we did in Colorado. So it actually is illegal for someone to sell a gun on the internet or out there over their back fence without conducting a background check.
But now, but this is the thing, it's still happening though. Like how there obviously are still gaps even in that law, right? So yeah, Abbey, do you want to add to that?
Well, just to Tom's point, and I know he worked on that, closing that loophole. We want to do both, right? We want to work at the state level and we need to work at the federal level. You're only as strong and as safe as your surrounding states. California typically gets put up as one of the states with the strongest gun laws. And we know that the Gilroy shooter a year ago this summer purchased his firearm in Nevada. The purchase would have been illegal in California, and then drove and committed his act of violence. So we need to do both. And I think working locally and working at the state level is so effective, because you can foster the relationships with your lawmakers, right? You can get to know the people you want elected, like we're doing here. And then you have to go nationally and say, as a country, we cannot stand for, our children hiding in corners, for 52 women a month being killed, 10 children a day. And in most cases, those are domestic violence situations for the children. So I think we need to do both, just to Tom's point. It's both, and Congress does need to change. We're slowly working on that too, so.
We have some questions. So what is being done about law enforcement personnel who refuse to abide by the laws by not collecting firearms? Brian, Gordon?
Sorry, I was muted. I don't totally agree with the premise of the question. It's not so much that law enforcement refuses, it's that we have to have a mechanism for them collecting it. And yes, there is sometimes some pushback on that because they want to be safe when they do it. But it's a larger question, and that is, what is the mechanism for actually enforcing a judicial order when it comes to insisting that a domestic violence defendant who's been convicted properly relinquishes their gun?
Gordon? Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, and Brian's right. I mean, there are legitimate safety concerns that law enforcement have going into homes, especially if someone's been deemed a risk via the red flag law or something else. So we want to make sure that, folks are protected and that they're able to do it safely. We've had a lot of certainly kickback from sheriffs and others about enforcing them. I can't really speak for every other county, but I know in Larimer County, even though our sheriff was vocal against the law, he has not said that he will not enforce it.
Okay. We have another question. Do we have any stats that would be helpful in advocating for the success of the ERPO law this far? I'm thinking to write a letter to the editor. Well, thank you, Renata. You are a great activist. Thank you. Abby?
Tom, did you want to take this one?
Oh,
about the red flag?
Yeah, I'd say go to the Colorado Ceasefire website. I believe we've got something on there about the status so far on how it's been implemented. We don't have the huge numbers of cases the way that the other side said that we would have.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of cases of abuse. Certainly that case in Fort Collins was an example, but it was resolved. I think we've seen a very reasonable implementation of it, and we've seen that in the cases that it has been implemented, it in most cases really made a lot of sense.
Yeah, and also I guess I'm particularly looking at Weld County because I want to do everything I can to get Sally elected. And so that's why I'm going to look into like a local paper there to see if I can bring that up because of course suicide rate in Weld County, I mean the 50% are successful by guns. And but I guess what I'm also wondering is I'm talking to somebody who is an expert at suicide prevention in Weld County in Greeley, and she knows of people who have lost people to suicide, and IRPA was not in existence yet. So I'm trying to get some actual stories. But if anybody knows of stories, particularly in SD23, where I can really, cling on to a family where maybe the person was saved or the person was not saved regarding suicide or whatever the case may be, feel free to, leave a message here. Just looking for stories and looking, I'll look at the big picture on your ceasefire thing and just also looking for the big picture of it so I can put it all together.
Oh, thank you.
Sally,
Tom, could you put your website in the chat for us? And just so everyone knows, you can save this chat. See the 3 dots in the chat there? If you just click on that, it'll save it. And so you'll be able to look at that after.
Sally, I just wanted to add, if I could, about the red flag law. I believe it's been implemented 73 times in the state and since January. And the article that Representative Kipp dropped in the chat box has a little map, I believe, that you can hover over the counties. And I do see a comment about Sheriff Reams in Weld County had pretty vocally stated his opposition to enforcing it. Weld County actually has 6 cases that the map shows. So we know that these are state law. The legislature passed them. They're signed by the governor. Once it gets to that point where a law enforcement officer or a family member requests this extreme risk protection order, they are required to follow through with the law. And somebody else can jump in. And I haven't heard of any case where those who have a duty to follow through with that have declined and then someone has been in danger or a life. So it is working pretty successfully.
I think the minute that someone does and then there's a tragedy, you're going to see a big change. It won't be a question of what's the enforcement mechanism. It's going to be the shame of not following up and something tragic happening. And I think it's going to change the environment dramatically.
Tom, I agree with you. I've been posed that question too because my sheriff, I'm in Weld County, refuses to follow it. And I say that in my heart, I know that when he is put in that situation and he's got to seriously think about the loss of life, I'm hoping that he does follow the law because you don't want to be wrong because you can't go back, right? So I agree with you. And hopefully that does not happen. We have some more questions here. It seems to me that the IRPA law is similar to CRS 2765. I'm not familiar with that, which gives law enforcement transmission. The IRPA law is very similar to CRS 2765, which gives police the power to bring a person in for psychiatric assessment related to danger to self, danger to others, or grave disability. Can Gordon or Brian, can you speak to that? Or maybe Representative Cathy? Kipp?
Well, I'll take one crack at it. In terms of
Tom.
the ability the police have right now, we've seen too many cases, and in fact, the tragic event in Highlands Ranch was a fine example that right now the ability the police have, it's a much higher standard, and you're basically putting somebody on a mental health hold, and in most cases, because we don't have enough beds in Colorado to take care of these cases, they usually get released pretty quickly.
Is it less than 72 hours?
Firearm. So. No, they're very different situations, and to me, clearly, the ability to do the mental health hold does not address the problem.
That's why we need funding for mental health services so desperately. Okay. Is there any safeguards for unregistered firearms, like automatic search of a home in a domestic violence or reasonable cause? Gordon, Brian, Tom, Abby.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. Is it just whether folks can have unregistered weapons? I mean, it goes back to, I think, the earlier question about what the standard is for law enforcement being able to do that. And, again, there are situations like the red flag law where a judge will issue a warrant so that officers can actually go legally do that. There are certain other situations where officers might have, again, probable cause to be conducting some sort of search, but they can't just go into a house without evidence just because there might be a domestic violence situation going on.
Leif, did they answer your question? I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. Leif? I don't know if they can. Okay.
I think you did answer my question. You're getting to a lot of topics that I like. My real question is, there just seems to be places where it's just like not appropriate to carry guns. Would we be able to say like those places are off limits? Because it seems like, if I'm going downtown Fort Collins, that just seems to be like, why would I need a gun? But like if I'm in the woods out in like Laurie State Park, hunting bears or whatever I'm hunting, that seems appropriate. It just seems like there's all this like latest like, oh, I got to show up with an AR-15 at the local McDonald's, and that just seems like where the problems just start to happen, because people extend that to kind of like, hey, there's that protest going on, let's show up with my gun too. Like, we've seen that quite a bit lately, especially like in Kenosha and stuff like that, where it just seemed like very inappropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone want to address that?
We are an open carry state, and we also have a concealed weapons law, though, so it depends whether it's concealed or not concealed. And if you want to change those things, you have to do them through the law.
I'll just add that in Colorado, or in most jurisdictions in Colorado, a business owner has the right to exclude firearms from their property, whether it's a grocery store, a McDonald's, or coffee shops. Though not all business owners know that. And I think that's part of our work going forward, is to educate business owners about their rights to keep firearms off their property.
That's a really good point. And but then that also brings in, into focus too, like just like now with COVID in North Carolina, there were people who walked down the street, almost like a mob, down Main Street with showing their weapons because it was legal for them to do so, and they were going into businesses and threatening them in a way, saying that that it's their right to carry, but it's not the law that they have to put a mask on at the business. So I think that even if business owners are aware that they have that ability to refuse service to people who don't want to wear a mask or who are carrying firearms, I think that you still have that hostility, right, that they have to deal with. And I think that, no business owner should have to deal with that. But that's the case that's happening across the country. And, I almost feel like they feel powerless, right, to to take on their right as a business owner, that this is my establishment and, you know, these are my rules. And so, Tom, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, we have had a number of large national retail outlets like Target and Walmart say that they do not want guns brought into their stores. I think it's a lot more difficult for small businesses, local businesses, to say that because they're afraid of losing business. And even Target and Walmart, though, will acknowledge that if someone does carry, if they become aware, they don't want a confrontation. We're really talking about a cultural change. We really have to say, what do we want life to be like in America, and what is acceptable and not acceptable? And right now, we're struggling with that.
You know, I volunteer at a food bank, and within the last 2 months, there's a sign that says no guns allowed. We've never had that before. So whenever I see stuff like that, I think, well, we must have had an incident, right? I don't know why you would even want to bring a gun to a food bank. So yeah, I mean, so far people have been abiding by that sign. But I have to tell you, as a volunteer, it kind of took me back before I entered when I saw that sign, because I thought, wow, am I not safe? Do I have to worry about that? I didn't even cross my mind before I saw that sign. Abby?
I was just going to add on to a couple of points. Open carry is meant to intimidate, right? That's its purpose. So we see that, we see these demonstrations like Kenosha, North Carolina, where the sole purpose is intimidation. And in those states, in Colorado, they have the law right now to back them up. You can, on a local level, Denver was able to push back against that and have, I don't know the legal term if anyone wants to help me, but basically the city and county of Denver, you can't open carry in because we have a more eminent, you know, stake in terms of safety in being a large city. But to Tom's point, businesses have a big role to play in pushing back against the open carry and no guns allowed. And so Walmart made a big step. Kroger's this past year made big steps in guiding that and saying, no, you know, we don't allow that in our business. And that puts the frontline workers certainly in a difficult situation if they are asked to confront somebody. But open carry feeds into that power and that intimidation.
You know, I meant to address this at the beginning, but to me, I just don't know how this became a partisan issue. I really just don't understand how it has become, it's almost like the environment, right? Why is that partisan? So I guess my question is to anyone here, you know, how do we create common ground? I mean, we all care about each other. We all care about public safety. And we all know too that if any of these laws really were meant to take away anyone's Second Amendment right, it would have already happened, and it has not. I know for myself on my platform, you know, I do state I'm committed to protecting the Constitution, the Second Amendment, but I'm also in support of common sense gun legislation. So, you know, Tom, what are your thoughts?
The public is in large agreement.
Yep.
Polls have shown that Americans, a good majority of Americans, support the Second Amendment. They don't want that right taken away, but they also agree on the need to have restrictions. They don't think it's an absolute. It's the people on the political side who've made this an issue to differ themselves from their opponents.
Oh, so go ahead, Gordon. Sorry.
Well, I agree with both of you. You know, you'd think we could find some common sense middle ground. You know, there was just the former deputy of the NRA just released a book and has been making the media circuit this week if folks have seen it, and essentially said he regrets what he did there and does support some common sense reforms like background checks and other things, and that Essentially the NRA was in it for themselves. And, thinking a lot about Tom's point that he made earlier about the fact that, when the rhetoric is, we want good guys with guns, but then they fight red flag bills, showing what the real motivation is. So it's unfortunate, and there might not be some people we can win over, but Colorado, like a lot of states, has a lot of folks in the middle ground, right? We a lot of candidates on here know most voters are unaffiliated. And so I think there are a lot of folks in the middle that do want to keep their community safe. And it's not an anti-Second Amendment perspective. It's a community safety aspect.
We closed the gun show loophole in Colorado with a 70% vote. 70% of the voters on that ballot said, yes, we're going to close the gun show loophole. 90% of Americans now, over 90%, support universal background checks, and yet you can't even get it heard in the Republican Senate. You clearly have a disconnect when you can't even get a hearing on something that's supported by 90% of the people. There's something seriously wrong.
Absolutely. Ike, do you want to speak to that, since that's like a federal?
Yeah, I mean, my opponent, Ken Buck, is probably one of the worst perpetrators of this. The real problem we have is a non-responsive legislature. Ken Buck takes 73% of his money directly from corporate PACs. He's taken over $830,000 directly from the NRA, from one lobbyist organization. And that's why we have a non-responsive legislature. That's why we can't, pass or even floor a bill for a vote in the Senate, is because we have a whole bunch of paid for corrupt politicians in office. And it's one of the primary reasons I'm running for office and I have a 100% grassroots funded campaign. And I want to get that corruptive influence out of our government so that we can have a responsive legislature, so that we can pass common sense reforms like Safe Storage Act. And somebody asked, how do we create that common ground? And that's something that we really have to address out in Congressional District 4, because, there are places and locations where law enforcement might be an hour and 45 minutes away in some instances. And so, people do need their Second Amendment rights. But that doesn't mean that we can't have safe storage, regulations in place that'll protect kids in their homes, that'll prevent close to 78% of school shootings from happening, because the only reason 78% of school shootings happen is because adolescents, kids, just like the kids that broke the glass cabinet, picked up the firearms, and carried them to my son's school at STEM Highlands Ranch and shot Kendrick. Just like that. The reason kids have the ability to do that is because they have access to improperly stored firearms. And so we need a National Safe Storage Act. And that one act right there could reduce school shootings by 78% and make our kids much safer in their homes, like that 3-year-old that was mentioned that got shot by an accidental discharge by his brother or sister just earlier, about a month ago in Westminster. So those are the things that we need to do to create that common ground, is have the conversations across the aisle about the tough issues. And when I have those tough conversations about safe storage, like with my lifelong Republican neighbor, most of the people, 70% of the folks I talk to in my neighborhood, a lot of them Republicans, agree that we need safe storage. And so that's how I think we create common ground, is by tying it to exactly where the issue should be tied to, and that's the safety of our kids in their schools and in our homes.
Especially now too with COVID, a lot of our students are home, right? So we have to think about that. But then I also think too, with the safe storage law, it would also help reduce the suicide that is astronomical here in Colorado, not to mention across the country. But I think that it's a twofold, right? Absolutely agree with you. we have some questions I wanted to get to before we go. That's why I said I knew we wouldn't have enough time. We could go on and on with this. You know, one thing I wanted to mention too about the NRA is, I don't know when things changed for the NRA, but the NRA actually used to care about training their gun owners. You know, they cared about the people that purchase guns. And they cared about training them and having them be responsible gun owners. So I don't know when that whole thing changed. I think that, you know, if you purchase a motorcycle, you have to have training, right, before you can get on the road. And I think that that should be the same across the board for anyone who purchases a firearm. They should have to go through training, right? And, you know, in addition to background checks and all these things. And I just, again, that just seems like common sense to me. Okay, so if you have fear that a person you have a relationship with might be a threat to you, it's insufficient to remove the guns. But if you're a mom going to a school program and you don't feel safe from a random event without a gun in your purse, that's okay? Anyone want to take that?
I personally find that that speaks more about the state of our nation with gun violence. Because if you don't feel safe to go to your school program without you owning and carrying a gun, that should say more about essentially what people call the bad guys. And I know that there's so many people saying like, we should, you know, make laws that target the bad guys, but really things like universal background checks and waiting periods, like those do target the bad guys. And just like you were saying, Sally, like, if you are trying to ride a motorcycle, it takes training. You have to get tested. You have to learn how to ride. You know, as one of the youngest people on this panel, I'm not far off from having gotten my license. And I had to have my permit, my learner's permit for a whole year. And I had to operate a vehicle with someone who was over the age of 21, not just 16. And like they needed to be with me in the vehicle while I operated it until I was then 16 and could do it on my own. But all of that also included testing and on the street driving. And it, as a student and as, you know, someone who has like a little brother who only recently graduated high school, you know, praise the Lord, I find it, you know, a bit, you know, frustrating that there's no gun laws that, like someone mentioned in the chat that cars weren't made to kill people or kill things, but guns were, even if you just use them for hunting. So why are the laws so, like, why are there such disparaging laws between the two of them on how you can operate?
Thank you. It's so true. And I love that you bring that perspective, because we don't know what that's like, you know, and it's unfortunate that you're living through that. My kids are living through that. And anyone on this panel who have children, they're living through that when they go to school. I mean, even, you know, after the Aurora shooting, we worry about going to the movies now or going to any public event, a concert. And we should never have to worry about that. You know, we're going to have a good time. We're going to meet other people and socialize. And, you know, then we have to think in the back of our mind that we may not make it back home again. Or our children who are going out to the movies or going to a ball game or to school may not come home again. And so this is why I'm having this. And this is why I have no problem saying that I'm a gun sense candidate, because we do need to do this. And, you know, violence is an epidemic here in the United States, and something needs to be done. And like, you know, like you said in your paper, Kenzie, you know, after Columbine, we should have learned, but we have not. Let me just try to get through these before we go. We are inflicting damage on our children. We have to do better. This is inexcusable. Yes. If we can control where guns can be and can significantly control the power of guns in public, magazine size, fire speeds, size of a gun, Yeah, the magazine limit, absolutely. It seems the Second Amendment is outdated and was written so long before all the automatic weapons we have now. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they had muskets, you know, back in the day. You know, we did ban assault weapons. They're not, you know, so now they're not banned. And so why do we need an assault weapon in civilized society? That's a military weapon. You know, I mean, Ike, am I right? Like, if you want to shoot an AR-15 or an AK-47, join the military, right? It's not something that you go and you purchase in society. There's no reason to have something like that. I don't even know why we're even having this conversation where it's still, you know, available.
I own those firearms. I own some of the firearms that you're mentioning. I think we need to do a much better job of defining what an assault weapon is, because the assault weapons ban, for instance, bans a whole bunch or a few different types of firearms, but at the same time leaves a whole plethora of firearms and accessories on the market that do the exact same thing. And so I think we need to have a better definition, and I think this needs to happen at the federal level, of what a battle rifle is, what an assault weapon is, and what type of specific training and education and qualification you need in order to own specific types of weaponry. If those measures are in place and someone gets the proper training, education, qualification to own a certain type of weapon or firearm, and they have the federally provided biometric capable safe, and we have a National Safe Storage Act in place, and we have comprehensive background checks in place, the problem that exists around scary weapons will be mitigated by the comprehensive reduction in firearms violence and injuries. I don't think that an assault weapon ban actually does the job that we're attempting to do, which is reducing access to the type of weaponry that can inflict the type of damage that what people refer to as assault weapons are referring to. And so I think we need much more, specific definitions of what battle rifles are, what semi-automatic weapons are, what assault rifles are, what assault weapons are. For instance, the majority of firearms injuries and deaths are caused by, pistols. And those aren't even classified in an assault weapons ban, although they function exactly the same way the weapons that are defined as assault weapons function. So I think we need a much more minute and specific definition of the type of firearm, and we need much better restrictions and regulations in place with respect to what proper training, education, and qualification and storage requirements and transportation requirements are in place for specific types of firearms.
Well, that's a good point. I didn't think of it that way. But I mean, I could totally play devil's advocate with you though. I mean, aren't all guns assault weapons? Really?
Absolutely.
So I guess my question is like, why would you need an AR-15, right? I mean, you're not going to shoot an animal with that, right?
Well, right.
You're not going to protect. Are you going to protect your home with that? I mean, I don't know. I guess that's why I have you on here, because I want that perspective, and I want that perspective to be shared with others, because these are probably things that other people who don't own guns think about, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up. I never thought of that.
Right. I think the way that we reduce across the board firearms violence is by instituting that. And, this is what really stands the chance of actually making it through the US legislature is like that National Safe Storage Act, is like that universal background check. And like, those are the first steps I think we take towards, you know, radically reducing firearms injury and violence. And then we take the further steps of defining, you know, specifics with respect to types of weaponry and what training, education, and qualification are required for all types of weapons, instead of like, you know, defining one as an assault weapon while others are not defined as assault weapons that do the exact same thing.
Right.
So I think there's more comprehensive ways of addressing the problem and reducing firearms violence, and not infringing on the Second Amendment.
Thank you, Ike. So Leslie has a question. Can anyone speak to ghost guns and controlling these, make your own weapons? Oh, okay. Yeah, that is a loophole. That's a big time loophole. Abby?
Yeah, ghost guns are a huge issue, and either through 3D printing or assembling parts that you can get legally and then put them together. I am not versed in laws that would really comprehensively reduce that, but you would need to, the parts available, you would need to prohibit access, so that the other way they access them is printing them through 3D printers. So there was a case down in Texas of an individual posting the plans, the 3D printing plans online, and basically anyone could access them. So regulating that, but it's a huge issue, and it predominantly ends up with people who have ill intent in terms of violence and gun violence.
And they're untraceable, is my
They're
understanding
yep.
as well. That there's
there's no serial number on them. They're basically blank. You can, you know.
Yeah. There's no trail. Yeah.
There's no trail. There's no record of them, right?
We did go over, I knew we would, and we still have so much to accomplish, but I'm going to close by thanking all of our panelists. And I hope that we were able to address some of the important issues that are on people's minds. And I do have several questions here. So what I will do is I will take these questions and I will get answers for you. And we will follow up on the ones that weren't answered, because we ran out of time. So thank you all so much for spending your evening with us. And I think I'm gonna have to have another one, a part 2, because we could go on and on about this issue. So thank you again. I really appreciate all of your inputs and your perspectives, the different perspectives. And I think it's important that we keep having these conversations, because that's how we elevate the conversation and make actual progress. So thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.